For 80 years, Germany held back, not because it lacked the economic capacity to build military power, not because it lacked the industrial base or the technological sophistication or the organizational capability that serious military forces require. It held back because the memory of what German military power had done to the world twice in a single century had been written into the national identity, embedded in the constitutional architecture, and enforced by the collective understanding of a nation that had emerged from the ruins of its own catastrophic overreach with a specific and deliberate restraint that its neighbors had relied upon and its allies had been grateful for across 8 decades of post-war stability. That restraint is over. Friedrich Merz has just committed Germany to a 150 billion euro annual defense budget by 2029. A number so large it does not merely match the combined defense spending of France and Britain. It obliterates it. Germany is not modernizing a peacetime force. It is building a war-ready military machine at a speed and scale not seen on European soil since the Cold War. The constitutional debt brake that had been the symbol of German fiscal discipline for a generation has been suspended specifically to fund this expansion. Germany does not break its fiscal rules. The fact that it has done exactly that tells you everything you need to know about how seriously Berlin is treating the threat environment it now believes it faces. Europe's quiet giant is no longer quiet. And the question being asked behind closed doors in every capital from Paris to Warsaw to Washington to Beijing is the one that nobody is yet saying loudly enough in public. When Germany becomes the most powerful military force on the European continent, who exactly will be able to tell Berlin no? The restraint that defined German strategic culture across the 8 decades following the Second World War was not the natural condition of a nation that had always been cautious about military power. It was a constructed restraint, deliberately engineered into the institutional and constitutional architecture of the Federal Republic by founders who understood that Germany's neighbors and Germany's own democratic future would be better served by a country that channeled its formidable national energies into economic reconstruction and multilateral engagement rather than military assertion. The basic law, Germany's constitution, had been written with specific provisions designed to prevent the concentration of military authority that had enabled the catastrophes of the first half of the 20th century. The Bundeswehr, the armed forces established in the 1950s, had been structured from its inception as a parliamentary army, deeply integrated into NATO's command structure, and deliberately designed to be incapable of autonomous military action outside the alliance framework that kept it accountable to democratic oversight and allied constraint. This arrangement had served multiple purposes simultaneously. It gave Germany's neighbors the reassurance that German military power would never again operate outside the multilateral framework that NATO's collective defense architecture provided. It gave Germany itself the security guarantee that allowed it to redirect the resources that military competition would otherwise have consumed into the industrial and social investment that produced the German economic miracle. And it gave the United States the reliable European ally whose economic weight and geographic centrality made it the indispensable anchor of the NATO alliance's European dimension while maintaining a military posture that never threatened American strategic primacy on the continent. The arrangement had worked for precisely as long as the foundational assumption underpinning it remained credible, that the United States would defend Europe, that the American nuclear umbrella was real and unconditional. That Article 5 of the NATO treaty was not a political commitment subject to revision by changing administrations, but a strategic guarantee whose credibility rested on the accumulated weight of decades of American military presence, investment, and demonstrated willingness to treat an attack on any NATO member as an attack on the United States itself. When that assumption began to look conditional rather than absolute in the political environment generated by Trump's second term, the strategic calculation that had produced 8 decades of German military restraint stopped producing the same answer. German strategic planners confronted a scenario whose implications they had been modeling with growing urgency as the signals from Washington became more ambiguous and the evidence from Ukraine of what Russian military aggression looked like when it encountered resistance without an unconditional American backstop became more concrete. What happened to Germany specifically, sitting at the geographic and economic center of a continent that suddenly had no guarantor, in a security environment where Russia had demonstrated both the will and the capacity to use military force to redraw European boundaries, and where the American commitment to preventing it from doing so had become a matter of political calculation rather than strategic certainty? Merz's answer was not to seek reassurance from Washington. It was to build the kind of military capability that did not require reassurance from anyone. The Readiness 2030 plan, whose name had been chosen with the deliberateness that serious strategic communications require, was not a modernization program or a reform initiative or the kind of incremental defense investment increase that Germany had been promising and failing to deliver on the 2% NATO spending target for years. It was a transformation program, a commitment to rebuild the Bundeswehr from its current state, which decades of underfunding had left significantly below the operational readiness that its paper strength suggested, into a genuinely war-capable force whose scale and sophistication would make Germany not merely a contributing member of NATO's European defense architecture, but its dominant pillar. The 150 billion euro annual budget figure was the number that had produced the most immediate and visceral reaction when it was announced, because its implications for the European military balance were so direct and so measurable. France currently spent approximately 47 billion euros annually on defense. Britain spent approximately 60 billion. The two strongest military powers in Western Europe combined spent around 107 billion euros annually on their armed forces. Germany's target did not match that figure. It exceeded it by more than 40%. Berlin was preparing to outspend both of its major European allies simultaneously within 4 years, and to sustain that spending level indefinitely as the baseline of a military capability that would reshape every power calculation on the continent. The plan's content went beyond budget figures into the specific capabilities that the investment was designed to produce. Armored divisions whose equipment and training would restore the Bundeswehr's capacity for the kind of large-scale conventional warfare that Russia's operations in Ukraine had demonstrated was not a historical relic, but the dominant form of the conflict that Germany now needed to be prepared to deter or fight. Long-range precision weapon systems that would give Germany the capability to project force beyond its borders with the accuracy and the range that modern warfare required. Air defense systems designed to address the missile and drone threat that Ukraine had made visible as the defining feature of contemporary conflict. Drone warfare capabilities, whose development Germany had neglected across the period when its defense investment had been minimal, and whose importance the Ukrainian experience had confirmed as central rather than peripheral to military effectiveness. Military infrastructure across German territory and beyond its borders, whose construction would signal to allies and adversaries alike that Germany's military commitment was physical and permanent rather than political and reversible. The constitutional debt brake suspension was the detail that carried the deepest symbolic weight for anyone who understood German political culture, and the specific role that fiscal discipline had played in the national identity that the Federal Republic had constructed across the post-war decades. Germany did not break its fiscal rules. The Schwarzennull, the commitment to balanced budgets, had been not merely a policy preference, but an expression of national character whose abandonment in normal political circumstances would have required months of contentious debate and would have faced constitutional challenges that could have delayed implementation for years. The fact that Merz had steered the suspension through Parliament with unusual speed and with the cross-party support that the security context provided told you everything about how completely the strategic environment had shifted in the assessment of the German political class. The domestic debate that the Readiness 2030 plan had generated was serious and substantive on both sides of its central argument. Its supporters advanced the case with the directness that the security situation they believed Germany faced warranted. Europe had been sleepwalking through a decade of growing instability, whose trajectory pointed unmistakably toward the conclusion that the post-war security architecture whose stability Germany had enjoyed and whose costs it had substantially avoided paying was no longer capable of sustaining the protection it had provided without the kind of European military investment that Germany's restraint had prevented it from contributing. Russia's war in Ukraine had demonstrated that large-scale conventional military aggression on European soil was not a historical memory, but a present reality. American commitment to NATO had become politically conditional in ways that made the strategic free ride Germany had enjoyed for 80 years no longer available at the price that had previously been charged for it. A militarily capable Germany was not a threat to European stability. It was the only realistic foundation for European stability in a strategic environment where the American guarantee could no longer be treated as unconditional. The critics were equally forceful and equally serious in the concerns they raised. The social and economic costs of military expansion at this scale would fall on the ordinary Germans whose hospitals and schools and housing programs and pension systems would be quietly defunded to pay for armored divisions and missile systems whose relationship to the daily challenges of German domestic life was at best indirect and at worst actively harmful to the social fabric that democratic governance was supposed to protect. And beneath the fiscal argument lay the darker question that the critics were willing to ask publicly, even when its raising produced discomfort in the rooms where German strategic policy was being discussed. Whether a Germany rearmed to a scale not seen since the 1940s was truly something that Europe should be comfortable with, regardless of how thoroughly democratic the institutions currently governing it appeared to be. The reaction spreading through European capitals in the weeks following Germany's rearmament announcement revealed with unusual clarity the fault lines that 8 decades of carefully managed post-war European order had covered without resolving. The restraint that Germany had maintained across that period had not merely served German interests and American strategic requirements, it had served as the foundational condition for a specific kind of European political equilibrium in which no single member state held military power sufficient to make its preferences structurally unavoidable for the others. That equilibrium was now ending, and the divergence between how different European governments were experiencing its ending told you more about the actual architecture of European power and European anxiety than any official communique or alliance declaration produced in Brussels or Washington could convey. France's reaction was the most immediately consequential and the most politically revealing because it came from the government whose strategic self-conception was most directly threatened by what Germany was doing. Macron had built his European foreign policy vision around a concept whose intellectual architecture was sophisticated and whose political foundation was a specific assumption about the distribution of military capability across the continent. European strategic autonomy, the idea that Europe could and should develop the capacity to act independently on the world stage without automatic dependence on American military power, had always rested in practice on a quietly understood arrangement. France would provide the nuclear deterrent and the permanent UN Security Council seat that gave European security policy its ultimate guarantee and its international legitimacy. Germany would provide the economic weight that funded European institutional ambition and the political commitment that gave EU frameworks their central member state anchor. The combination made France indispensable to European security in ways that no amount of German economic power could replicate because France possessed the specific capability, nuclear weapons, and the international status they conferred that Germany's constitutional restraint and its neighbors' political comfort had kept permanently out of Berlin's reach. A Germany spending 150 billion euros annually on conventional military forces did not need French strategic cover in the way that a